Hi, this is Avril Angevine inviting you to a discussion of the beat and the hip, San Francisco art in the 1950s and 60s. It's safe to say that San Franciscans are living in a boom time. The Bay Area is the epicenter of the tech explosion that has transformed so much about the way we live now and will live in the future. But of course, this is only one of many booms that have transformed the Bay Area since the biggest boom of all, the gold rush, in 1849. No doubt it's natural when a city experiences quick and startling change to reflect on the way it was before, the way it was when I first got here. So today we're going to take a trip back, a little way back in time to a San Francisco that was much smaller, but definitely cooler and hipper than it is today. We're going to go back through the 70s, all the way to the 1950s, the post-war years. Despite the arrival of thousands of people, Rosie the Riveters and others, who made the Bay Area the shipbuilding capital of the world during the war, San Francisco was still small in the 1950s, provincial in many ways, charming perhaps, but certainly not the art capital of the world. It was not New York. And yet, San Francisco produced a wide range of powerful art as artists both created their own variations on abstract expressionism and went off on tangents unknown to the New York sophisticates who, then as now, largely ignore West Coast culture. I'm going to introduce you today to a whole crowd of fascinating artists, some known to you, I'm sure, but many not, who responded to NorCal's creative freedom in wonderful ways. So let's start by comparing New York and San Francisco in the 1950s. Well, New York, of course, is much bigger, and it's much more sophisticated, filled with Europeans with their Louis Vuitton luggage, European art, and collectors. There was also an active gallery scene. Here we see an image from Peggy Guggenheim's famous Art of This Century gallery. The artists in New York are asking, how can I push painting forward? How can I give myself an identity? And what kind of artists? Artists like Mark Rothko, who claimed to paint only the most basic human emotions, tragedy, ecstasy, doom, and so forth. Or like Franz Klein, or of course, like Jackson Pollock. Meanwhile, San Francisco is smaller. Artists had much less opportunity to see European and even East Coast art. Magazine photos, for example, convinced local artists that Willem de Kooning used the same thick paint as is typical of San Francisco artists. In fact, his paint application is quite thin. Artists also had less opportunity to sell to the buying public, whom we see milling around on Maiden Lane here underneath the House of Pets. There were not very many happening galleries in San Francisco. In fact, people bought art at Gump's. But we did have museums. The De Young was open since 1895, the Legion of Honor in 1924. SFMOMA, one of the nation's first museums dedicated to contemporary art, opened in 1935 and showed Picasso's Guernica in 1939 and was host to Jackson Pollock's first solo museum exhibit in 1945. So without the gallery scene, San Francisco's art schools became a decisive force in the post-war period, particularly the Art Institute, known at the time as the California School of Fine Arts, shown here in a photo by one of its more famous instructors, Ansel Adams. Art schools exploded in the post-war years when 70 to 80% of the students were on the GI Bill. Men returning from war were not particularly interested in practical skills, and in fact, Congress voted down a provision to restrict the GI Bill to practical topics. Men returning from war were interested in the humanities, in art, especially modern art. And the new director at the Art Institute revamped the curriculum, even putting a curtain over their famous Diego Rivera mural to show that a new spirit was afoot. He invited in lots of new instructors and generated a lot of excitement. The artists studied, worked, and partied together. And in this photograph, we see David Park on the piano, Elmer Bischoff on trumpet, and Wally Hedrick in there on the banjo. The artists were working and developing in a collegial, not a market environment. And of course, this was also the era of the beat poets. Even Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac migrated from New York to San Francisco, where the vibe was more Zen than existentialist. So the post-war art story really begins with Clifford Still, who arrived at SFAI at the Art Institute in 1946. He was actually one of the first artists to move into abstraction. In 1941, he gave up all figuration and began making images just from lines and colors, as you can see in the photo here. And he stayed with this style without major departures from the 40s to his death in 1980. Here we see him with Mark Rothko, who also taught a summer session at the Art Institute, looking like a couple of radical bohemian artists there. Still was a powerful influence on students and colleagues, and he set out to train an entire generation that painting meant passion, individuality, freedom from rules, in a nutshell, abstraction. So a work like this of his, a huge work, over 9 by 12 feet, has a raw, unfinished look using line, color, light, and these jagged forms, perhaps related to the natural landscape. Under Still's influence, abstract expressionism swept through SFAI, though, as one former student put it, the longer you studied with Still, the less like his work yours became, which sounds to me like he was a good teacher. Let's look at some of the Bay Area painters who expressed Still's passion for abstraction in their own ways. The two best known are Richard Diebenkorn and Sam Francis. Now, Diebenkorn moved to San Francisco as a very young boy. He attended Lowell High and went to Stanford, where he fell in love with Matisse, whose works he saw at the Palo Alto home of Sarah and Michael Stein. These early works of his rather than Matisse's luminous colors, show the oxblood reds prevalent in San Francisco abstraction of the late 40s. The one on the right is called Sausalito. Can you see why? He was living in Sausalito at the time. So this shows us that in Diebenkorn, even in abstract works, there's something landscape, something figurative under the surface. However, after stints in graduate school at Albuquerque and at Urbana, Illinois, where Diebenkorn rather improbably did this work entitled Beach Town, Matisse is in the ascendant. Diebenkorn's palette lightens and he lets slip-up mistakes, pentimenti they're called, and airy space into his works. Like this one of the Berkeley series, Berkeley 53 from 1955. We'll hear more about Diebenkorn in a minute. Now, Sam Francis, a native of San Mateo, studied psychology at UC Berkeley, though Still recalled seeing him hanging around at SFAI. He took up painting while recovering from a spinal injury sustained in the Army, eventually creating large works of luminous color and ragged shape that hint at Still's style, like this one, Opposites from 1950. In that year, he took off for Paris and lived there and in Japan until settling in Santa Monica in the early 60s. In Paris, he was celebrated as a representative of an École du Pacifique, which perspicacious French critics saw as an alternative to the work being done in New York. Time magazine called him the hottest painter in Paris these days, based on works like this one, Big Red from 1953. Like Diebenkorn, he was an ardent admirer of Matisse. Well, what artist wouldn't be? And he produced colorful abstractions, often dominated by blue, like this one, Blue Balls, which combined freely thrown and dripped splotches with disciplined grid structures. These gave way to looser configurations and kind of web-like patterns in his later works, and he died in 1994. We can find a few more devoted abstractionists at SFAI in the late 40s, such as Frank Lobdell and Hassel Smith. Lobdell created works that were, in the works of critic Thomas Albright, somber, dramatic, agonized, and grave, like these two perhaps. By 1950, he had developed a style that had a bit of Clifford Stillism to it, rugged paint handling and powerful color, but with shapes that still suggest associations. Like, for example, this work that's at the Oakland Museum called 15 April 62. Again, like Still, Lobdell's ambiguous, enigmatic images suggest roots in the indigenous art of the Pacific Northwest. Rather than suggesting the energy and action of much abstract expressionism, Lobdell's work seemed weighty, the result of hard work and difficult art choices. In his later works, though, in the 70s and beyond, Lobdell, who taught for many years at Stanford, lets in light and air, though his works always hover between abstraction and figuration. He died in 2013. Now, Hassel Smith takes us in a different direction, more typical of a distinct San Francisco attitude that just can't be suppressed. His works are full of action and sometimes have an almost comical quality, including cartoon-like pictographs or anatomical shapes, and their titles reinforce that edge. This one is called Alone with the Killer. And how about Triumph of Gargoylism from 1957, or the wonderful To the Moon from 1961. Though he moved through a period of figuration in the 60s to what he called his measured or geometrical works in the 70s, he returned to a celebration of color, movement, and sheer painterliness in his last works, like this one here. So let's finish out the San Francisco abstractionists by looking at two lesser-known artists, and not coincidentally, they are women, Sonia Getchoff and Bernice Bing. Sonia Getchoff lived in San Francisco for most of the 50s and was an active participant in the local art scene, widely appreciated and exhibited along with the male cohort who apparently accepted women painters more readily than their New York counterparts did. The New York school was a fiercely macho place. Getchoff cited the work of Clifford Still as a major influence, especially during her shift from expressive figuration to abstraction. This is a work called The Chase. She was one of the first to work with a palette knife, and she produced energetic works with vortex-like marks of nuanced color, as in Etya from 1958. Getchoff and her husband lived in the famous Fillmore Street apartment building called Painterland, along with a revolving cast of artists, musicians, and poets, including both Joan Brown and her husband, Bill, and Jay DeFeo and her husband, Wally Hedrick. In fact, Getchoff may have influenced DeFeo to abandon the brush for the knife, producing the startling result we see in her major work, The Rose. You can certainly see similarities to it in this work by Getchoff called Painting 4 from 1956. Sonia and her husband Jim Kelly left San Francisco for New York in 1958. Though her work fell out of fashion, it continued to evolve until her death in 2018 at age 91. Now, Bernice Bing was not only a woman, but she was Asian and a lesbian to boot. But she, like Getchoff, was accepted as a participant. The local art world seems to have been kinder to her than history has been. This is a work called Lotus. She was born in Chinatown in 1936, and Bing's early life was filled with tragedy. She was orphaned very young and lived in orphanages, with white foster families, and occasionally with her strict Chinese grandmother. Though she struggled academically, she excelled at art. She's a graduate of Oakland Tech, and she attended both CCAC and the Art Institute, where she studied with Clifford Still, where she studied with Richard Diebenkorn, which I think you can see here. She also studied with Nathan Olvera and with Saburo Hasegawa, who interested her in Zen calligraphy, as well as Taoism and Buddhist philosophy, and ignited in Bing a lifelong devotion to spirituality. But she was also fully engaged in the lively beat movement. In fact, her studio was above the old spaghetti factory in North Beach, a known beatnik hangout, as you can see here. She held her own as a hard-drinking dancer at Painterland on Fillmore. J. DeFeo called her a fiery presence. Her first solo exhibition at the Batman Gallery featured a series of paintings based on Las Meninas, 17th century work by Diego Velázquez, which, as you know, has an image of the artist at his palette in the back of the picture at work, and we can see that here in the upper left as well. Bing worked in a range of jobs throughout her life, from vineyard caretaker to community art coordinator, though she continued painting works like this one called Anderson Valley, and she died in 1998. Now, you may be wondering where all this San Francisco abstraction has come from, since the art story of the era is dominated by the one true original art style to come out of Northern California, the Bay Area figurative movement. The movement was born when our next artist, David Park, took all his abstract paintings down to the Berkeley dump in 1949 and decided to return to painting the human figure. And that's because, as he said, art ought to be troublesome. And to him, the human image was an endless source of trouble. Basically, he went from this in 1948 to this, Kids on Bikes, a year later. His great friend Richard Diebenkorn said, "My God, what's happened to David?" And pretty much everybody else wondered that too. Park was from Boston, but he ended up in the Bay Area studying at UC Berkeley in the late 20s. He worked as an assistant to sculptor Ralph Stackpole, crafting plaster casts for the sculptures Stackpole was creating on the new Stock Exchange building, like these. In 1930, he met Frida and Diego, who stayed in Stackpole's studio during their visit that year. Park did a few WPA murals and experimented with a Picasso-esque style. He began teaching at SFAI in 1944 and was soon under the sway of Still's abstraction. Park said that the ideals of abstract expressionism, like vitality, energy, profundity, warmth, were his goals too, but he felt that his abstract works almost never achieved his aims. So he fell off the abstract wagon and he took a load of talented artists with him. Park's early figurative works, made in the first half of the 50s, are still characterized by thick paint and rough handling, standard abstract technique. But they introduced figures, ordinary people doing ordinary things. We'll often find a cluster of figures in the center made of shapes that fit together like puzzle pieces, as we see here in Dancers, a very small work that's at the Oakland Museum. He plays with perspective and foreshortening so that there's often a very large figure, maybe just a head, in the front, and small figures in the background. And here we have not just the small figure, but his shadow. He also likes to include a strong diagonal leading back into the plane. Backgrounds are sometimes without horizon or sense of actual place. And he manages to create extraordinarily economical faces, like in this portrait of his great friend Richard Diebenkorn. As the decade progressed, Park's figures became less and less defined. Backgrounds and any sense of specificity melt away. In a sense, Park almost returns to abstraction. In the last year of his life, 1960, Park was too ill to work at an easel. His final works were done in bed. These smaller format works in gouache, crayon, and ink are, if anything, even more abstract than his last works in oil. Finally, Frustrated with the small format, he asked his wife to find something larger. She provided a 30-foot roll of kitchen shelf paper, which he drew on with felt tip markers, which were themselves new at the time. The scroll contains scenes from daily life, no doubt parks. There are images of Boston Common and of UC Berkeley, and it ends with this haunting image. Park was just 50 when he died. Once we arrive at Bay Area figuration, Richard Diebenkorn comes sailing back into view. He's doubtless the best-known Bay Area artist, nationally and even internationally, and he produced masterful works, both in abstraction and figuration, in his characteristic NorCal colors. Diebenkorn said that his epiphany came while flying. Seeing the landscape from above gave him a structure for his works, and in fact, whether abstract or figurative, his canvases are often defined by geometric planes. For about a dozen years, beginning in 1955, Diebenkorn concentrated on figurative subjects, though he didn't restrict himself to the human figure as Park did. Besides portraits, often of his wife Phyllis, Diebenkorn did still lifes, landscapes, and views, such as this one of his first, Chabot Valley of 1955. Despite his predilection for landscape, Diebenkorn rarely painted outdoors. In these two works, that's Cityscape, and this one is called Seawall, Diebenkorn has achieved the order and elegance that characterizes his mature landscape views, whether pure studies like these, or as the background to portraits, or glimpses through open windows, which is a compositional favorite of his. Though it is simplified into blocks of color, Seawall suggests the essentials of the Northern California coastline. Diebenkorn liked to insert a human figure, mostly women doing kind of ordinary things, into his landscapes, but he went out of his way to avoid sentimentality or story. And one way he did this was by simplifying the form. Facial features are suggested rather than actually depicted. And he often said that the face had to have a compositional importance in the painting. In other words, what's it doing here, rather than representing character, as would be the case in the old masters. And for comparison, here's David Park's Woman with a Coffee Pot. And you can see the difference. It's another Diebenkorn, this one on the left, called Figure on the Porch. It used to have a palm tree in it. I think it was a good idea to take it out. Where would it be, I wonder? And this interesting work, again showing his interest in windows, called Interior with Doorway, actually represents his studio at the time, which is where the Ashby BART station is now in Berkeley. Now, here's a little quiz for you. Which of these two sketches is by Park and which by Diebenkorn? Yes, you're right, that's the Diebenkorn on the right. Now, there are a couple of other really powerful figurative painters that we need to discuss now, and that's Nathan Olvera and Elmer Bischoff. Both are local guys. Olvera was born in Oakland and graduated from San Francisco's George Washington High School, where the controversial mural is right now. He attended CCAC and taught art at several colleges, including his alma mater and the Art Institute, and for 32 years he taught at Stanford. Now you may have to stretch your imagination to consider a work like this, Spring Nude, as figurative. Olvera's isolated figures, painted in an improvisational style, seem to have more in common with someone like Willem de Kooning or Francis Bacon than with his local colleagues. With their soupy backgrounds, Olvera's works, like this one, Adolescent by the Bed, show a sense of human isolation, a sense of conflict, even angst, that are also motive forces in New York school painting. Here's a print of his that reminds us that Olvera was moved most of all by Rembrandt. Of Rembrandt, he said, "I see a human living presence and an energy that touches me. It's that presence that keeps me painting." Now, Olvera died in 2010, And in 2014, Stanford opened the Winhover Center, which houses a series of works by Olvera, inspired by the hawks he saw gliding over the hills above Stanford. The series is named after Gerard Manley Hopkins' poem, The Windhover. It's an homage to a dapple dawn-drawn falcon. Elmer Bischoff is also local. Born in Berkeley, he attended Cal and returned from service in World War II to find himself in the midst of the whirlwind at SFAI, where he was both an important teacher and a full-time artist. His early works are abstract, naturally, but he gained fame with figurative works in the 50s and 60s. As he said, figure painting was the culmination of a search for more stimulation, more provocation, or as David Park would have put it, he was looking for trouble. And this is Girl in Orange Sweater from 1955. And this work, Yellow Sky, I must say that I first saw this last year when it was out at SFMOMA, and I was absolutely staggered by it. It's huge, and the colors just leap off after you. It's absolutely beautiful. But by the later 50s, a new vibe was happening in San Francisco. The figurative group, who had rebelled against the dominance of abstract expressionism, were themselves the elder statespersons, and younger artists, as usual, absorbed what they had to say and then turned it on its head. Beat culture gave way to the hip, which of course would have an even greater cultural influence in San Francisco than beatnikdom had. And did you know that Herb Caen coined the name beatnik? He came up with it based on Sputnik. I guess he thought that the beats were far out. And as for art in this period, it was all over the place. The best way to group this last group of artists is to call them early funk. Artists were gathering in upstart galleries, clubs, and communal living spaces like Painterland, and the spirit of collaboration and cross-fertilization was as strong as ever. Many of these later artists combined media or worked in several. Here's the King Ubu Gallery, a former auto body shop on Fillmore Street, was founded in 1952 by Jess Collins, more about him in a moment, and his partner, the poet Robert Duncan. A few years later, Wally Hedrick took it over and, as the Sixth Gallery, hosted what has been described as the most important poetry reading of the 20th century on October 7th, 1955, when Allen Ginsberg revealed to the world that the best minds of his generation were destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, dragging themselves through the Negro streets at dawn, looking for an angry fix, angel-headed hipsters burning for the ancient heavenly connection to the starry dynamo and the machinery of night, and so forth and so on. Among those associated with the Sixth Gallery and probably present at this event, besides the six poets and Jack Kerouac, who passed around a jug of wine, were Elmer Bischoff, Roy DeForest, Robert Duncan, Sonia Getchoff, Hassel Smith, Joan Brown and Jay DeFeo, Manuel Neri, and a 19-year-old Leo Vallador. So we'll frequently find the second generation at 2322 Fillmore Street, known as Painterland, home of two of the most innovative of this second wave of San Francisco artists, Jay DeFeo and Wally Hedrick. Let's look at the centerpiece of DeFeo's career, something that she worked and reworked, or constructed in paint, as she said, scraping down, building up, scraping down, building up for over 8 years. And that's the work called The Rose. Now, right away, we can see that she's on a different wavelength from the figurative crowd. This is a marriage of painting and sculpture, huge and crusty. It's 10 feet tall and almost 8 feet wide, and at the thickest, at the bottom, the paint is 8 inches deep. The whole thing weighs over a ton and took her, as I said, several years to achieve. Basically, it's between 5 and 10 canvases piled on top of each other, scraped down and rebuilt using, supposedly, $5,000 worth of paint. So much paint that dries so slowly that in the early days it quivered as people approached it. There she is working on it. Gives you an idea of the size. She stopped working on it when she was evicted from the Fillmore Street apartment, at which point the Rose went to the Pasadena Museum, where she worked on it some more. Here are some pictures of the thing being taken out of her apartment. They had to cut a hole in the window to manage it. And there she is up on the fire escape watching her baby being handled by those expert art handlers at Beacons. So it went to Pasadena, eventually was brought back and exhibited at SFMOMA, and finally ended up behind a wall in a conference room at the Art Institute, where it stayed for 25 years. After DeFeo's death in 1989, the Whitney Museum became interested in restoring it as part of a beat culture exhibit in 1995. There's a couple of other works of hers in which I'm sure you can see a similarity to the Rose. There's a low-key palette. Usually she uses either color or texture, but generally not both. And in these works, as well as in the Rose, her inspiration is in botanical forms, grasses, feathers, things like that, and they're done with a palette knife, not with a brush. So DeFeo and Wally Hedrick found themselves right smack dab in the middle of the cultural upheaval of the times. They didn't confine their revolt to their art making. They were politically active and delighted in revealing the dark, damp corners of 50s commercialism and prosperity. And they were characters with a capital C, particularly Wally Hedrick. So let's look at some of his works. On the left, Madame New's Barbecue of 1963, and on the right, a Hermetic Image. And in the middle, his Xmas tree from 1955, unfortunately destroyed. As it shows us that Hedrick pioneered assemblage and junk art and had the kind of irreverent take on art making that would inspire the Davis funk artists of the 1970s. He used popular images, radios, TVs, flags, and so on, well before New York's pop artists did. But because San Francisco artists so disdained the art world, they remained little known outside of the San Francisco scene. At one point, Hedrick was employed by the Vesuvio Cafe in North Beach to make paintings while a jazz group played. He apparently could make 5 or 6 a night. Here's one of his famous students. Yes, he's truckin'. That's Jerry Garcia, who credits Hedrick with turning him on to beat aesthetics and attitudes. And this is Hedrick's War Room, 8 5-by-11 canvases, all painted a deep black, bolted together, black side facing in, to create a freestanding room that could be entered, as you see, by a small door in one of the panels, thus creating an architectural or environmental painting, which he referred to as Wounded Veteran. During this time, Hedrick was accused of stealing paintings, including a canvas by Clifford Still from the Art Institute, then either painting them black or painting his own iconoclastic pictures over them. I don't know if this is true. Likewise, Bruce Conner produced an astonishing variety of works while hanging out at the Art Institute and on Fillmore Street. He's best known for assemblages of women's nylon stockings, parts of furniture, broken dolls, fur, costume jewelry, paint, photographs, even candles. These works, created between 1957 and 1964, seemed both old and new, avant-garde and funky. They were a vehement rejection of the optimistic, consumerist spirit of mainstream American society. Now, the East Coast pop of Robert Rauschenberg and Andy Warhol was ironic, but Conner's stuff goes well beyond irony into open disdain. And he was also a maker of experimental assembled films, and many consider him one of the undiscovered masters of late 20th century art. And then there's Jess. a former participant in the Manhattan Project and the Hanford Atomic Energy Project in Washington State, who abandoned his career and his last name to devote himself to art. He enrolled at the Art Institute and began making collages and paintings using imagery from chemistry, alchemy, the occult, and male beauty. Mouse's Tail, which you see here, is one of his paste-ups. And as you can see, it's composed of images cut from magazines. You can see a whole group of clowns there, and the figure is made up of images of, well, largely naked men, probably from bodybuilding magazines and so forth. Here's one of the series he did called Translations. This one is called Far and Few. I'm sure you recognize those boys. These are oil paintings in a heavy paint-by-numbers style on canvas surrounded by velvet-covered wood. And they are, of course, blown up from photographs. And each had a text on the back. On the back of this one is Edward Lear's poem, The Jumblies, which starts out, far and few are the lands where the Jumblies live. Their heads are green, their hands are blue, and they went to sea in a sieve. I think the Fab Four would actually really like that poem. Then we have Narcissus, a paste-up that took him 30 years to complete, with exquisite graphite drawings in it. This is at SFMOMA. In the center, we have Eros with a bow and arrow. We have the spurned lover at his elbow, complete with a crazy cat comic in his hand. Chicago's Monadnock building in the center there. Most of the images on here are taken from other artists. Finally, we're going to look at the work of our last two artists, also residents in the Fillmore Street building, whose work revolves around presenting the female in art. And that was the husband and wife team of Manuel Neri and Joan Brown. So Neri comes of a family of Mexican immigrant laborers. He was a student in engineering at UC Berkeley, but just took an elective ceramic course which blew his mind. He became a student at SFAI, overwhelmed by Still's idea of what an artist should be, and decided that he would just become one. He was also later one of the important founding instructors in the art department at UC Davis in the 1970s. So let's look at what he does. Oh, he's a sculptor. Not working in marble, not working in bronze. His works are made of plaster, a funky, down-home industrial material. Now, he had to work quickly because plaster dries quickly, but it could be reworked by lopping parts off and adding parts on. When they were dried, he slopped house paint over, using the plaster as sort of an abstract expressionist canvas. He began these plaster sculptures in 1955 after seeing some similar works, smaller ones, by DeFeo. And almost all his works are studies of the female. He was inspired to devote his art to women's imagery by the birth of his first child, when he really understood the importance and the fecundity of the female. Meanwhile, Joan Brown was a local girl who went to the Art Institute on a whim. She applied with a portfolio of sketches of movie stars she had copied from fan magazines. When Brown first saw the kind of work that was being done at SFAI, she thought it was pointless. But a year later, she was doing this. This is Girl Bathing at Night. You can see that the figures are reduced to the barest possible information. In fact, you have to look at this for a while to discover that there is a girl in there at all. It's in this sludgy, heavy impasto with some bright colors going on in it. She was interested in the deep, dark, penetrating works of Rembrandt, Goya, and Velázquez, and we can see her working with these influences in this work called Flora from 1961. Now, Joan Brown got a lot of attention early on as a woman in what was still considered a man's world. In 1960, when she was 22, she had her first show in New York and was the youngest person ever represented in what has become the Whitney Biennial. She was even featured in Mademoiselle magazine. In 1962, her son Noel was born, and under guidance from her main mentor, Elmer Bischoff, Brown decided to focus on the world around her. And we see Noel in the kitchen. That's her son. Noel with his diaper drooping, and her 2 dogs. And I don't know if this is an accurate picture of her own kitchen. And she also sometimes modeled for Manuel Neri and did this large work, which shows his studio with models in it, and of course the dog down at the lower right corner. But by the later 60s, the times, they were indeed a-changing. Brown was no longer satisfied with her thick, dark works, so she gave up her New York gallery contract and devoted a year to studying, to improving her technique. And when she began to exhibit again, her style is radically different, and we feel that we're entering another time, another place, another mood when we see Woman Wearing Mask and After the Alcatraz Swim. So she's moved from oil on canvas to enamel on masonite, making images flatter and more brittle. They require skilled drafting rather than just color application. And she created representational images from dreams and from her interests in life, like dancing, mythology, and swimming in the bay, swimming to Alcatraz. Humans and animals, who are still important to her, are now in a 2-dimensional space and in lighter colors. And this is where we're going to end, as the San Francisco art scene is eclipsed, for a while anyway, by a surprising new wave emanating from the east. I mean, just a little way east and slightly north. As the 70s dawn, there's a big ball going on in Cowtown. And by Cowtown, I mean the newly formed art department at UC Davis. But that's a story for another day. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you soon.